Welcome. This afternoon, we're speaking with Jamal Shah, who is an air expert at Liberty Travel. Jamal will be talking about travel back to Australia. Obviously, there's been a lot of concern about flights, getting flights, booking flights, etc. And Jamal is going to talk us through the process, expectations, and speak a little bit about to his business as well. So Jamal, welcome.
Thanks, James, for having me. Hello, everyone at home. This is, I guess, the new way to communicate these days, but it's always nice to connect with my Australian friends.
I know there's been a lot of things happening recently. There's some announcements late last week with the Australian government, which we'll cover in a minute. But I think it's a good idea perhaps to set expectations right now. We've had a bit of feedback from members who are quite shocked to hear that they can't just book a flight and get back to Australia as they would normally this time of year. Perhaps you can just talk through a little bit about your experience, what's been happening over the past months, and just sort of give people an idea of really what the expectations are these days of travel between the US and Australia.
Absolutely. So, I mean, pre-COVID, getting a flight to Australia was a relatively easy thing to do. We had, obviously the big three American carriers servicing Australia, along with Qantas and Virgin and, a host of other carriers, Chinese, so on and so forth. But since about April, May, obviously service has been, severely lessened. I think the biggest thing right now for people to kind of keep in mind is that you're not going to get a flight, booking last minute. It's just not going to happen. And if you do intend to take that trip over Christmas or, sometime in the Australian summer, you need to start looking ASAP. Obviously there's other things we can get into. One of the things that I've noticed as well, in addition to dwindling service, is obviously the Australian government has a cap. So for the next 3-4 months out, it's like, basically business class is the only way to go. And, there's numerous articles, all over the internet kind of publicizing this issue. So that's just something else for people to keep in mind. Those economy tickets for $1,200, $1,400 that normally we would balk at and say, you know what, this is just insane. I can't believe they're charging this much. Now it's more like a $6,000 economy ticket or a $10,000 business class ticket. And, it's just kind of skyrocketing for most people, I guess.
If you can speak a little bit, I know this is a little bit outside of your purview, but the whole issue of quarantine. So obviously when someone does book a ticket, the airline notifies the Australian government that this passenger is in fact flying to Australia and has to go through quarantine. Can you speak a little bit to that?
So as far as the quarantine goes, the airlines do in fact hold the responsibility of staying within the caps per the Australian government. The issue there is basically, if you have, you're a single person going to New South Wales, like for example, you arrive in Sydney, you might be going somewhere else as your final destination, but you would have to still quarantine in Sydney. This is a big departure from what goes on in most of, in the rest of the world. With the States, you can connect in New York, and fly to LA without having to quarantine in New York, so to speak. Australia does not work that way. You'll have to pay for the quarantine there. You have to sign an affidavit of repayment, so on and so forth. One of the things that the government has done for its citizens is provide these kind of disaster relief or, emergency relief funding, which is, either, I think it's $1,500 for flight assistance to get back home. And obviously they take into account the average economy one-way cost, which these days just isn't, all that realistic given the pricing. But they also do things where they'll give you a certain amount, of course, Australian dollars of support just to kind of stay put wherever you are, shelter in place, if you will, for a certain period of time before you can buy your tickets back home. So people do have options, but that quarantine is a big thing that people have to consider into travel expense. It's not just the $10,000 for the ticket or the $6,000 for the ticket. It's also, in addition to whatever they're going to charge you over there, and each state has their own regulation.
Right, Jamal, I was just going to go back to what you said before about how you can't get an economy ticket. I know that the feedback we're getting is that if you are going to purchase a ticket to Australia, stay right away from the aggregators, the kayaks, the price lines, because if you book a ticket through that and it's cancelled, you are going to have enormous challenges getting a refund or reissued. So it's really the only two options are either to go through an agent like yourself or directly with the airline. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct. So what happens normally, and we're talking again, we're going to talk about pre-COVID and during COVID. Pre-COVID, you'll go on Kayak or whatever kind of website there is, and look at probably 15 different fares, all very low cost, and they might look good. And you might book one, you find out it's overbooked, and then the airline, you get to the airport, they put you on another flight because they have 5 other flights to put you on. Nowadays, what is happening not just with Australia, but really for all markets, primarily those long distance international ones, they are actually selling flights that haven't been canceled yet. So we know that these flights are canceled, right, per the airline's internal systems, which we have access to. So I, as an agent, would look at it and say, I'm not going to book that. But you, as a consumer, are looking at something that is kind of like wishful thinking. The 1% chance they don't cancel it, we've sold you that ticket at a great price. But the reality is we know that these flights are not going to take off per internal memos, so on and so forth. But aggregators don't necessarily, share that information, because if they did, they would only be able to offer you one option. And when you go to an aggregator, you don't want to see just one option. You want to see the 15, 20 options that you're accustomed to seeing. So it's almost like clickbait. Your money is now tied up with Kayak, with the airline, and the airline obviously is not directly responsible for it. It's really that third party. That third party is, basically going to wash their hands of the situation and say, you have a credit with us. And even getting a refund through something like that can be the most tedious thing. So yeah, going through an agent or the airline directly is the best way. I would say, obviously, I'm partial to the agents, excuse my bias, but even from a personal perspective, just to have somebody in your corner, somebody with access to agency contracts, which can be absolutely key in this market where, you have to buy business class tickets, right? So we obviously have contracts in place where if they're selling it for a certain price, we might be able to get you a discount. Obviously everything is contingent on availability, but having someone in your corner is the key.
I'd also like to go back to is that why only first and business class tickets are guaranteed. And that, of course, has to do with the limited number of seats the plane can sell. So obviously they're going to sell the most expensive tickets before they fill economy, correct?
Absolutely true. So let's look at, for example, Emirates, which is a very popular airline connecting people around the world. A lot of Australians prefer the Middle Eastern carriers for their quality, especially when you talk about business class. But Emirates, for example, makes $7 a profit per economy seat. For business, that's probably, it's 100 times over. The benefit in them selling their business class exclusively, you're right, it does lie in their revenue, but it's also, partially as a result of the mandate of a lot of these governments where they have to keep certain flights in operation regardless of passenger count, right? Obviously, if Australia was open, and you'd get a lot more people. If there wasn't a cap, you'd get a lot more people. But considering the current circumstances, it doesn't make sense for them to say, let's fill out 2-3 rows of economy and make, basically lose a ton of money, as opposed to potentially selling 20-30 business class seats and maybe breaking even for the cost of what it takes to fly that plane.
Exactly. Now, obviously, we've seen some of the social media photos of people who are in economy, and it looks like they're the only people in economy. And I think probably those people were the very lucky ones that business didn't sell out, so their economy tickets did stick.
Yeah, so I had one of my clients take a flight back in August, and he was lucky enough to get the last economy seat on an Air New Zealand flight. And when I say it was the last economy seat, I mean this flight literally, within I think 3 hours was just gone. So I was lucky to have held it when I held it without him even confirming if he could if he could do those dates. The other aspect to this is, if you do have an economy seat, you kind of have to be prepared for a potential, of being bumped off because of the cap. So a lot of times airlines will rope you in with an economy and then say, you know what, we reached the cap, or this other airline reached the cap for the destination for the day. Are you able to fly next week or 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, whatever the situation is? With a business class seat, that's a little bit less likely to happen, obviously, because of what you're spending. The cap is on the number of people total, not the number of people in a certain cabin. So if somebody is willing to pay $7,000 for a business class ticket, 2 weeks after you bought your $1,500 economy ticket, you might be bumped off.
Because that's really what people are not understanding. Why is it my flight is canceled, or I had a ticket and now I'm told I have to rebook the ticket. And this essentially is that you may have a ticket and you may have paid for it, and you might believe that you have a 24A as your row, but if someone comes along and fills and that the airline will sell the business class ticket, which will essentially bumps you off the aircraft because there's only a limited number of people they can put on that aircraft.
Absolutely. And the good thing about the Australian government and, the airlines that are kind of operating in and out of Australia specifically, and I haven't seen this with any other destination, is that they tend to give at least 48 hours notice if your flight, if you're going to be bumped off or canceled or so on and so forth. Other situations you wouldn't find out perhaps until you get to the airport, which would obviously, be extremely inconvenient. But the key here is to remember that, yes, you're buying a ticket, but at the time of that purchase, if you, for example, go down the economy route, if you're dealing with an agent like myself, you can ask the hard questions. How many seats are in economy right now? How many seats are in business class? That'll give you an idea of where you stand in terms of potentially having to rearrange your travel plans. Because if I tell you it's the last economy seat and business class is wide open, then you understand that their interest as the airline is still to sell as many business class seats as they can. And if that means compromising your economy seat, they will probably do it. Because again, COVID goes beyond just health and safety. It also has a serious economic impact. And that's what these airlines at the end of the day, that's kind of what they're thinking about, is how can we maintain or maximize whatever revenue streams we currently have. I think the reality sets in is when somebody sits on that flight from LA to Sydney or from San Francisco to Sydney and looks around and says, there's only 30 people on this plane. And, I can't imagine them flying like this for longer than they need to, because you realize it's 100 and, usually about 210 seats. Some of those planes, Qantas was flying the 747 for a little bit. They fly these jumbo jets and you're talking, 30, 40 people on that entire plane. It's just not practical,
Yeah. Well, look, let's talk a little bit about some better news, and that is the Australia. It was announced on Friday, I believe, the Australian government or the cabinet has looked to increase the number of people that actually can fly to Australia now, to try and clear some of those Australians, or the tens of thousands of Australians who are apparently stranded in different parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, so obviously, there's been a lot of pressure towards the government in terms of trying to increase that cap, and I think they have. I think the goal is to get to 6,000 a week. Obviously, each state has their own regulations. I think now state-to-state travel is becoming easier as well. And all of these things, I think, it's a very complex process, because you can't just increase the cap if the states still want to maintain their own individual restrictions and regulations, because it's just going to make things more complicated. But the future does, it does look bright, relatively speaking. And I think in the coming weeks, we're going to start to see, more seats open up. It's not going to be a massive increase. Obviously, you can't just do that. They still want to maintain the safety aspect of it in terms of controlling who comes in, where they're coming from, so on and so forth. But the good news is that they are going to up the ante there a little bit.
Right. We're going to put some links in the comments below. I think they were talking about September 28th that New South Wales was going to increase 500 a week. And then obviously there's no flights into Melbourne. That's a given, or Tasmania. But the other states were looking at, increasing 100, 500. And I think there were several states, I think Queensland was one of them, that's doing a staggered. They're going to increase it around the end of this month, and then October again. Again, the goal being to get to around 6,000 from the existing 4,000.
The other thing that we have to kind of keep in mind is that, as these kind of metrics go towards in favor of the people, it's also something to keep in mind is that, COVID's impact has not ceased, right? So a lot of people that, are on work visas in the US and so on and so forth, their employers might have held out till now, but now you're going to start to see other aspects of the economy, furlough staff and kind of work that in. So we might have kind of a sharp increase within the next couple of months. especially as we hunker down around this election time. And once the election's over, things kind of reset. So it is a very critical time in terms of making sure that those numbers go up, because we might have a few more people wanting to go back home.
And Jamal, if someone wanted to reach out to you, one of our members is watching this, say, and they want to reach out to you, how would they do that?
Absolutely. So, obviously my email will be in the comments section or the link below. You're more than welcome to get in touch with me in case of any questions. And, one of the things that, kind of set expectations within reality is that, having an agent is not kind of a, it's not something that guarantees you a seat on the plane that no one else can get, but it does guarantee you the most accurate information, right? Which means, is that plane actually sold out or is it not? I saw this online. I just want to know what you think. And from consulting to actual booking, I'm more than happy to kind of assist. This is a time where, like I said earlier, people need all the support they can get. I cannot stress enough, the importance of having factual information. In the age of alternative facts, which I can't even believe is a phrase, having, I guess, mainstream facts is what matters, and being able to gauge, how many times a week does this flight go, operate, or how many times a month nowadays is really the question. And, just trying to finagle all of these things. And, for people in the US, obviously, we have Australians in every state, making those connecting flights, making sure the times match and everything. And if you're trying to meet up with family and friends, it can be daunting. And, if you're traveling with children, especially, it's even more so. So absolutely, I'm more than happy to help out anyone who's in need of assistance or guidance.
So Jamal, okay, I've managed to get a flight to Australia for Christmas, and I'm looking to come back in, say, January sometime. What are the expectations around that in terms of flights back to the US? Notwithstanding the fact that obviously there are regulations in Australia that are preventing certain Australians from leaving the country. If you're a resident of the US, obviously you come back. But notwithstanding that, what are the flights looking like back to the US?
Right now, everything is projected as normal for the month of January, February, March, in terms of the US carriers. Australian carriers obviously have limited their operations, so you won't find too many flights with them. Obviously, the great Virgin Australia is in bankruptcy, so they have their own problems. But as far as your average United Airlines, American Airlines, Delta flights, these are projected to operate as normal. But government regulation and obviously given the time frame that we have until January, can we be hopeful? I think at this point it's important to kind of understand that if you do go to Australia for Christmas, there's a chance you may not get a flight back. Okay, so that's important. When I say not get a flight back, doesn't mean you're going to be stranded there forever, but it may not be the smoothest of experiences. It's just contingent on what happens really stateside in the wintertime. If the COVID numbers jump the way how some projection models are expecting, we may have another shutdown. It probably won't be as long as the first one that we had, but this is something that even if you're traveling, outside of the holiday season, we have to keep in mind. Spring 2021 is kind of when we expect to see a more normal level of operation where you don't really have that kind of insecurity, whether your flight's going to go or not. But for January, I would say it's important for people to kind of consider that as well.
Well, look, Jamal, thanks so much for your time again. I appreciate you taking time out of your day for this. And as I say, we'll put your contact information in the comments section. So if someone wants to reach out to you directly, they'll be able to do that.
Thank you so much, James. I appreciate your time. And I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Take care.